turn on notifications and never miss the beginning of a new story again. Join us and be part of every chapter. The relentless Levantine sun blazed over the valley of Elah, but a deeper chill, the chill of cowardice and humiliation, had settled in the hearts of the Israelite army. Days dragged on like quicksand in those lands of Judah, where the tension was not only the anticipation of battle, but the certainty of imminent defeat hanging over the camps. The tents of Jassa were the silent stage of a collective fear. The warriors, men trained for war, now murmured amongst themselves, their voices heavy with palpable impotence, for the sight of the enemy had robbed them of courage and the memory of divine promises. The ordeal was not the combat itself, but the shame of being paralyzed, accepting the mockery and oppression of an adversary that seemed to have been forged by pagan gods and not by men. And with each dawn, the yoke of the Philistine threat weighed more heavily on the soul of the chosen nation, revealing the fragility of a faith that bowed before brute force. On the opposite plain, the figure of Goliath of Gath stood not as a man, but as a monument of terror, the personification of affront. His bronze armor gleamed in the sun, and the weight of his spear was equivalent to that of a weaver's loom, each of his steps in the valley resounding like the harbinger of an earthquake. The narrator of the heavens could peer into his soul and saw there the poison of pride intoxicating every fiber of his being, the arrogance of a champion who had never known defeat and who blindly trusted only in the hardness of his metal and the vastness of his brute strength. His voice, when it echoed through the valley, was a thunder of mockery, a direct insult to the God of Israel. And with each challenge launched, the wound of despair deepened in the opposing camp. He moved with the certainty of one who was master of destiny, and his squire, who preceded him, was not merely a shield-bearer, but a living testament to the invincibility that the giant displayed before the eyes of all men. Far from that valley of despair under the blue sky of Bethlehem, a young man named David tended the sheep of his father Jesse, the youngest among his brothers, and the last to be remembered by men. His appearance did not promise the glory of a warrior. He had a ruddy complexion, but his penetrating and clear eyes were windows to a soul where faith resided unshakable, like a rock in the midst of a raging sea. While his older brothers feared on the battlefield, David found in the silence of the fields the deepest courage, not the courage born of military experience, but the courage that springs from the conviction that the eternal is a shield. In his heart, he could not conceive of the humiliation of the people of the covenant. His shepherd's mind could not accept that divine justice could be obscured by the shadow of a pagan giant, and this silent revolt was the first fire lit that would soon consume the paralysis of Israel. The turning point in fate often begins with the most mundane of acts. David was sent to the valley with a simple mission: to bring food to his brothers and a gift to the captain, an act of filial obedience that transported him from the field of peace to the arena of trial. Upon arriving, the scene that unfolded before his eyes was not that of an army ready for battle, but of cowardly men, and the sound that pierced his ears was not the clamor of war, but the blasphemous voice of Goliath, who, once again, challenged and vilified the ranks of Israel. At that moment, the shepherd felt a calling that was not physical but spiritual, the holy indignation that transcends human fear. The Eternal had other plans for that young man from Bethlehem. This was not a mere duel between men, but a testimony to divine glory, and David knew with a certainty that vibrated in his heart that his presence there was not an accident, but the fulfillment of a greater design. The solemnity of the moment demanded a response befitting the insult, but the only response heard in the Israelite camp was the silence of resignation. The warriors, enveloped in their heavy armor, looked at the ground, each immersed in their own fear and the grim certainty that no one would dare face the giant. That terror was not only of death, but of the defeat of faith that Goliath's challenge represented. The narrator, who saw everything, perceived that the spirit of Israel was broken, and the trial was not the combat itself, but the loss of the memory of the mighty works of the God of their fathers. The young shepherd, however, could not bear the weight of that humiliation. For him, the giant was not an enemy of flesh and blood, but the manifestation of impiety that defied the covenant. What was terror to others was an outrage to David that cried out for justice, and in his heart the voice of faith was louder than the clamor of war. David's murmurs, questioning the inaction and cowardice of the men, soon reached the ears of his older brother, Eliab, whose envy and skepticism were as thick as the morning mist. Eliab, with the pride of the firstborn and the bitterness of one who felt humiliated, confronted his brother with harsh words, questioning his presence and accusing him of having come to the field only to satisfy vanity and childish curiosity. That moment of familial contempt was David's first great personal humiliation in the valley. He was the youngest, the disregarded one, and now he was being reprimanded for having the courage his brothers lacked. But the omniscient narrator reveals that Eliab's motivation was not concern, but the fear of being surpassed by the youngest, the apprehension that David's genuine faith would expose the lack of faith that corroded the hearts of Saul's warriors. However, news that a young shepherd dared to question cowardice and propose combat reached the ears of King Saul, who, though tall in stature, was undermined by insecurity and depression. In his deep despair, the monarch summoned the young man. Before the king, David showed no fear. His courage was not youthful impetuosity, but the certainty forged in years of solitude, guarding the flock against wild predators. He did not see himself as a warrior, but as an instrument of divine justice. With words of profound conviction, he reminded the king of his encounters with the lion and the bear, episodes that for others were merely shepherds' tales, but which for him were living metaphors for the protection of the eternal. The lion and the bear had been defeated by the hand of his God. The Philistine giant, who dared to defy the ranks of the living God, would be no different. The young man's faith, though small in stature, was a balm to the tormented spirit of the king, who, in a gesture of desperate condescension, offered his own armor to David. The armor of gleaming bronze and considerable weight was the symbol of human military strength, the confidence in the sword and shield. David tried to put it on, but the breastplate and helmet were strange and heavy. They did not give him freedom of movement. They were not made for him, for his battle would not be fought with the weapons of men. It was a symbolic act of rejection of human strength and full acceptance of divine dependence. He took it off, leaving behind the metal and false security, opting for the simplicity of his shepherd's tunic, his staff, and, most importantly, his sling and the 5 smooth stones he carefully chose from the riverbed. At that moment, the Valley of Elah witnessed the transition from fear to faith, from the military complex to the weapon of conviction. The scene that followed was one of dramatic contrast that filled the Valley of Elah, a stage ready for the manifestation of justice. On one side, Goliath advanced, the mountain of flesh and bronze, with his shield-bearer at the head, marching with the certainty of inevitable victory, a thunderous sound of footsteps. On the other came David, the shepherd, with the simplicity of a boy but with the serenity of a prophet, moving not by the weight of armor, but by the lightness of faith. The difference between them was abysmal. The giant represented the power of the world, the strength that bends only before itself. The young man, the strength of the covenant, the power of a God who chooses the weak to confound the strong. The Philistine soldiers watched with mocking smiles, while the Israelites held their breath, torn between fleeting hope and the certainty of imminent mourning. When Goliath finally saw who was approaching for the fight, the giant could not contain the contempt that rose in his throat. His laughter was a roar of indignation and scorn, an offense that surpassed all his previous insults. He felt doubly humiliated, first for having his challenge accepted by an army of cowards, and second for seeing that the chosen one was a boy without adequate weapons, a shepherd with a staff. Pride blinded him. He did not see the warrior of God, but only human frailty. His malice led him to curse David by his pagan gods, promising to give his flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, uttering words that revealed absolute certainty in his invincibility and total ignorance of the power the young man carried with him. The narrator reveals that at that moment the giant sealed his own fate, for his arrogance prevented him from seeing the hand of the eternal moving towards him. David, for his part, was not intimidated by the size or the curses. His response was a speech of faith that resonated with the authority that only divine conviction can confer, a proclamation that momentarily silenced the valley. He confronted the giant not with his strength, but with the declaration that he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom Goliath had insulted. That moment was not about the skill of the shepherd, but about the honor of the living God. His words were a vivid contrast to the Philistines' bravado. Where Goliath promised death by the sword, David announced the triumph of justice, declaring that the victory would be a testimony to all the earth that there is a God in Israel. He moved with the certainty that the battle was not his, but the Eternal's, and that the Lord needed neither sword nor spear to save his people. The decisive confrontation was approaching, and David ran toward the giant, not with the slowness of fear, but with the haste of faith and conviction. In a swift and precise movement, he took one of the smooth stones from his shepherd's bag, placed it in his sling, and spun the artifact through the air, with the skill acquired in years protecting the flock. The sound of the stone whizzing through the air was the only noise that broke the deadly silence that had settled over the valley. The hearts of the Israelites were suspended, the eyes of the Philistines fixed in scorn. The stone, guided by a force that transcended human skill, found its target with surgical precision, the giant's exposed forehead, the only vulnerable point in all that bronze armor. The impact of the stone against Goliath's skull was dry and final, a sound that, though small, resonated with the force of divine judgment. In that instant, time seemed to freeze for all present. The giant, whose arrogance was his only helmet, staggered. The narrator, scrutinizing his mind, saw the shock and incomprehension in the Philistine's last glimmer of consciousness. The power he so trusted, brute force, had been struck down by something he despised, simplicity. The earth trembled not from an earthquake, but from the weight of his fall. Goliath tumbled with a monumental crash, his face turned towards the valley floor he had profaned with his insults. The silence that followed the fall was more deafening than any war cry, a void where before there had been the sound of threat and mockery. In that microsecond of absolute silence, the atmosphere of the valley of Elah underwent an irrevocable spiritual and physical transformation. The ancestral fear that had imprisoned the hearts of Israel for 40 days evaporated like dew in the sun. The soldiers' disbelief gave way to a wild and indomitable hope. On the Philistine side, arrogant confidence crumbled into chaotic panic. The figure who was the pillar of their strength and invincibility lay inert, defeated by a shepherd. The turn of fate was complete. Israel's humiliation had been washed away with the fall of the giant. David, without losing his composure, advanced upon the inert body, drew Goliath's own sword, the weapon that promised death to the Israelites, and used it to consummate the triumph, cutting off the Philistine's head. That final act was not one of cruelty, but the ultimate proof of the victory of faith. The triumph did not end with the giant's death. Seeing their champion beheaded by his own sword, the Philistines, seized by a terror that drained the strength from their legs, fled in despair. The whole army of Israel, previously paralyzed by fear, erupted in a war cry that came from the depths of their redeemed souls, pursuing the enemy with renewed fury. It was a day of redemption and divine justice, where the flight of the pagans was the visible manifestation of the Eternal's judgment. The victory was not merely military, it was the restoration of honor and faith throughout the nation. The young shepherd, once despised and ignored, was at the center of that epic, holding the giant's head as a trophy that did not exalt his strength, but the faithfulness of his God. That day, forever etched in the chronicles of Israel, marked the end of the ordeal and the beginning of the legacy. He who was the smallest, the underestimated, had become the instrument of the greatest victory of that time, proving that true courage is not measured in strong arms or heavy armor, but in the unwavering conviction of a trusting heart. The story of David and Goliath stood as an eternal symbol, a living prophecy that any giant can be defeated when the heart is in the right place. The narrator highlights how the name of the young shepherd, David, came to be whispered with reverence, the harbinger of a king who would, in fact, be after the heart of the Eternal. The nation of Israel had learned the most crucial lesson. The size of the challenge will never surpass the size of the covenant. David's return from the valley of Elah was not that of an ordinary soldier, but of an anointed hero, an event that split the history of Israel in two. The sight of the young man, still in the simplicity of his shepherd's garments, but carrying the giant's head as irrefutable proof of divine intervention, rekindled a flame of fervor that had long been extinguished. The women of the cities came out to greet him with songs and dances, exchanging the laments of defeat for the jubilation of unexpected victory. The satisfaction that filled the hearts of the people was the purest manifestation of justice being fulfilled. Indignation at the affront had been replaced by the ecstasy of redemption. The narrator reveals that at that moment, the figure of Saul, the king chosen for his appearance and human strength, began to be overshadowed by the glory of the shepherd, chosen for his faith and obedience, and the seed of the prophecy of a new reign was sown. David's glory, however, awakened a dark and corrosive envy in the heart of King Saul, an emotion that the omniscient narrator saw growing like a malignant tumor in his soul. The monarch, who should have rejoiced in the salvation of his people, could not bear to hear the songs that attributed 10 times more victories to David than to him. That triumph, which should have been his redemption, became his greatest trial, and the sight of the young shepherd, once a balm, was now a torment. Saul's skepticism regarding the true source of that strength, which was not his own, transformed into a morbid distrust. He saw in the young man not an ally but a rival, a usurper of his glory. David's ordeal, which seemed to have ended with the fall of Goliath, merely changed form, moving from the battlefield to the royal palace, where human malice was as dangerous as the Philistine sword. Years passed, and David's life became a chronicle of faithfulness and persecution. Saul's hatred, led him on a relentless hunt through the desert, a period of profound humiliation and loneliness for the young hero. David, who had been acclaimed, was now a fugitive, forced to live in caves and fortresses, an exile in his own land. The narrator describes the pain and incomprehension that assailed the heart of the Anointed One. He had proven his loyalty to the Eternal and to the King, but was rewarded with ingratitude and the constant threat of death. In that season of drought and mourning, his faith was tested again, but the covenant manifested itself in an even deeper way. Instead of retaliating against malice with violence, David chose obedience and mercy, refusing to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, even when the opportunity was given to him. Persecution and suffering, however, were not the end of God's plan, but the crucible for forging the character of the future king. In the solitude of the desert, David's faith deepened and he composed psalms that echoed his soul, cries of confidence amidst adversity. He was not abandoned, the Eternal was his refuge, and the trial was, in fact, a school of kingship. Marginalized, indebted and embittered men joined him, and David the shepherd became the leader of a small nation of outcasts, unknowingly preparing himself to rule Israel. Saul's malice served only to isolate David from the intrigues of the court and prepare him, in adversity, for the weight of the crown. That period of humiliation was the test of faith that would precede the full revelation of God's purpose. In that saga of trial and waiting, David's faithfulness contrasted brutally with Saul's spiritual decline. The king, consumed by envy and the abandonment of the Spirit of the Eternal, plunged ever deeper into the darkness of despair and disobedience. The narrator reveals the tormented thoughts of the monarch, who saw in David's triumph a decree of his own ruin, and in each frustrated attempt to capture him. If you're enjoying this story, take a second. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue with this exciting adventure. The invisible hand of a superior protection. Saul's skepticism had become an insurmountable barrier between him and divine favor, and his despair led him to seek help in forbidden practices, consulting spirits, and abandoning the principles that should once have sustained his throne. Divine justice manifested itself not only in the protection of David, but in the moral and spiritual decline of the antagonist himself, a dark omen of the end of his reign. The Eternal, who had other plans for his people, moved the pieces of destiny with the precision of a master weaver. Saul's malice ultimately led to his own destruction on Mount Gilboa, in a fateful battle against the Philistines, the same enemies David had defeated in the valley of Elah. The death of Saul and his sons, a tragic and inevitable end for one who had rejected the covenant, paved the way for the fulfillment of the promise made to David. The young man who had been persecuted and humiliated was now called to assume the throne, but he did not do so with the jubilation of vengeance, but with sincere sorrow for the fall of his king. The nobility of his spirit, forged in the desert, was the ultimate proof of his aptitude for governing, a stark contrast to the pettiness that had characterized the end of Saul's reign. David's ascension to the throne was neither instantaneous nor easy, but gradual, a process that demanded patience and the continuous reaffirmation of faith. First, he was anointed king over the tribe of Judah in Hebron, and years passed before all Israel recognized him as their sovereign. This transition period was crucial, a time when the military and spiritual leader matured, consolidating his authority not by force, but by recognizing that the hand of the Eternal was upon him. The vision of before and after was astonishing. The shepherd from Bethlehem, the fugitive from the caves, was now seated on the throne, the inevitable fulfillment of the prophecy that had been sealed in the valley of Elah. His triumph was not only personal, but the redemption of a nation that had strayed from faithfulness. With David on the throne, the contrast between the past of humiliation and the present of glory became vivid. He established Jerusalem as the city of the great king, a spiritual and political center that symbolized the renewal of the covenant and the security of the people. The Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of God's presence, was brought into the city with great jubilation, an act that underscored the centrality of faith in his reign. The ancient fear of the Philistines was replaced by a series of resounding victories, consolidating the borders and bringing peace to the land. Goliath's legacy was no longer terror, but the reminder that faith, not human strength, was the true pillar of the nation. David, the man after God's own heart, did not rule by his own wisdom, but by the guidance of the Eternal, and justice flourished in his reign. David's reign was the manifestation of a fulfilled promise, the culmination of a journey that began with the simplicity of a shepherd and the audacity of a believer. The vision of Israel once scattered and fearful, now united and strong under the leadership of a king forged in adversity, was a testament to the transformative power of faith. The neighboring nations, which had previously viewed Israel with disdain, now feared it, not for the strength of its army per se, but for the certainty that David's God fought alongside it. The narrator emphasizes that the king's triumph was not merely the conquest of territories, but the uplifting of the morale of a people who had learned that obedience and trust in the eternal are the true armor against any giant, be it a Philistine from Gath or internal disbelief. In that golden age, the figure of David established itself as the model of the ideal ruler, the anointed one who erred but repented, and whose covenant with God was unbreakable. He did not forget his origins. In his psalms, he celebrated the liberation and protection that had accompanied him from the pasture field to the throne. Each victory was a hymn to divine faithfulness, and each act of justice was proof that the Eternal's purpose had been fulfilled in his life. The humiliation suffered under Saul had not generated bitterness, but wisdom and compassion, and David ruled with the sensitivity of one who had known loneliness and persecution. The transformation of the young shepherd into the powerful king was the most eloquent of the chronicles of redemption. The alliance with David became the cornerstone of messianic hope. The Eternal promised him that his throne would be established forever, a prophecy that transcended the king's own life and pointed to a descendant who would be the full manifestation of divine justice and triumph. That shepherd, who had dared to face the affront of Goliath, became the ancestor of the Redeemer, the lineage chosen to bring salvation to the world. The story of the Valley of Elah, therefore, was not merely a tale of military victory, but the prelude to a spiritual epic that would culminate in the redemption of all humanity. Underlining that faithfulness in small trials, like facing a giant with a sling, is what qualifies one for great designs. David's legacy did not fade with his death. It is perpetuated in the memory of Israel as the king who taught his people the true meaning of faith and courage. Divine justice was fully manifested in his life. The malice of his antagonists turned against them, and his own perseverance in trial led him to glory. The contrast between the before, the humiliated young shepherd, facing the disbelief of his brothers, and the terror of the giant with only 5 stones, and the after, the powerful king, establishing a kingdom of peace and justice and becoming the eternal reference of the covenant, is the essence of the story. The victory over Goliath was not an accident. It was the inevitable fulfillment of the promise that the Eternal One does not forsake those who trust in him. The story of David in its entirety is an epic manual on the nature of trials. The Valley of Elah was only the first chapter of a saga where tests followed one another, each serving to refine the protagonist's faith. Saul's persecution, which lasted for years, was, in fact, a more severe test of character than the confrontation with the giant. There, David learned to wait on God's timing, to cultivate patience and to exercise mercy, even having the power to retaliate. The narrator emphasizes that David's true transformation occurred not on the day of the spectacular victory, but in the long nights of flight, where he had to choose between human vengeance and obedience to divine will. David's faithfulness during the years of humiliation and exile is proof of his unwavering conviction. He could have succumbed to despair, he could have joined Israel's enemies to overthrow Saul, but his faith prevented him from manipulating destiny. He knew that if the Eternal had anointed him, it would be the Eternal who would place him on the throne at the right time and in the right way. This profound understanding of divine sovereignty is what separates David from his antagonists. While Goliath trusted in his strength and Saul in his title, David trusted only in the covenant, and this trust was the engine of his perseverance, the guarantee that the promised triumph would not fail. The contrast between the malice of the antagonists and the faith of the protagonist is a central element in the moral elevation of the story. Saul's envy and fear led him to paranoia and ruin, while David's confidence led him to kingship and an eternal legacy. Divine justice manifests itself in a pedagogical way. Those who opposed the Eternal's purpose were consumed by their own wickedness, and he who humbled himself under the mighty hand of God was exalted. The shock and repentance that the narrator glimpses in the hearts of those who doubted David at the beginning and who now saw him as king were the ultimate tribute to their faith. The narration of this epic tale does not merely record the facts, it seeks to evoke reverence in the reader, indignation at the injustice suffered, and profound satisfaction at the victory of faith. The story of David and Goliath is an archetype of redemption, an ancient tale that teaches that power lies not in appearance but in conviction. The detail of the 5 stones, the simple and common object, becomes a symbol of God's choice to use what is weak and despicable in the eyes of the world to manifest his glory. David's transformation is the certainty that the trial is not a punishment, but the path to the inevitable fulfillment of the promise. David's ultimate triumph in unifying Israel and establishing his dominion was the inevitable fulfillment of the promise made in the shepherding field. He who had been the last to be called was now the first among all. Divine justice was fulfilled in a way that leaves no doubt. Saul's reign, built on force and distrust, crumbled, while David's, founded on faith and humility, flourished and became a beacon for future generations. The narrator, with the vision of a saga chronicler, records that the young shepherd's victory was not an isolated event, but the first step in a journey that redefined the history of Israel. The echoes of the Valley of Elah resonated in every act of King David. He never forgot the initial trial, and the memory of that day kept him humble and dependent. The contrast between the fallen giant and the small stone was the eternal symbol of his reign. It was not human power that guaranteed his safety, but the hand of the eternal. The description of his rule is not that of a tyrant, but of a shepherd who became king, who cared for his people with the same dedication with which he cared for his sheep, bringing law and justice to the nation. The malice of the antagonists from Goliath to Saul serves as the darkness that highlights the light of David's faith. Goliath, with his arrogance, represented the blindness of human strength that defies the divine. Saul, with his envy, symbolized the tragedy of lost faith, the fall of man who, despite being anointed, chooses the path of disobedience and fear. David's triumph is the condemnation of both. Strength without God is overthrown, and anointing without obedience is withdrawn. The reader's satisfaction is complete, for the narrative shows that evil consumes itself, while faithfulness is exalted. David's epic is a masterpiece of redemption, where every detail of the initial ordeal contributes to the magnificence of the final triumph. The fact that he used Goliath's own sword to behead him is a detail that cannot be overlooked. It is the complete reversal of power, where the weapon of oppression becomes the instrument of liberation. The narrator lingers on this point to emphasize the irony and majesty of divine intervention. The giant, who trusted in his mettle, was defeated by the simplicity of faith and by his own blade. The transformation of David from a despised shepherd to a powerful king is the climax of the chronicle. The narrator reveals that the man who ascended the throne was not the same one who descended into the valley, but a version honed and hardened by adversity. The solitude of the desert and the persecution by Saul had removed any trace of vanity or presumption that initial success might have generated. He had learned that royal power was not the permission to rule, but the responsibility to serve, and his faith had become a mature conviction, tested by fire. The narrative emphasizes how David ruled, always aware that his authority came from above. The justice he sought in his kingdom was a reflection of the justice he had experienced in the Valley of Elah and during his flight. He was not a king who trusted in horses and chariots like the neighboring nations, but in the strength of the eternal. The description of his reign is one of the triumph of spirituality over military pragmatism, an eternal lesson for the people of Israel. The eloquence of the narrative lies in the vivid contrast between before and after. Before, the Israelite camp was silent, paralyzed by terror and humiliation. Afterward, the same camp erupted in a cry of war and pursuit, transforming fear into holy fury, defeat into victory. The valley, once a stage for mockery, became the altar of redemption. The narrator uses this duality to maximize the drama and the feeling that the turn of events was a miraculous and inevitable event. David's legacy and the prophecy of his lineage ensured that the story of the Valley of Elah would not be merely a tale of war, but a foundation of faith. That day became a symbol that God's covenant was stronger than any earthly power, and that the Messiah would come from the house of those who demonstrated such faith. The account achieves its goal of inspiring reverence and satisfaction, for it shows that divine design uses the improbable to accomplish the extraordinary, and that faithfulness is always rewarded with a triumph that transcends human comprehension. David's glory lay not only in his military victories, but in his ability to maintain humility and dependence on the eternal, even at the height of his power. The narrator reveals that the king never allowed the crown to obscure the memory of the shepherd's staff. This fidelity, in its essence, is what guaranteed the perpetuity of his dynasty and the strength of his covenant with God. He saw himself as a servant, not as an absolute sovereign, and this perspective was the guarantee guarantee that divine justice would continue to flow through his reign. David's psalms, born largely during years of trial and flight, have become the enduring testament to his journey of faith. They are the voice of loneliness, the cry for justice, and the unwavering certainty in divine protection. Through these compositions, the reader can delve into the protagonist's deepest feelings, understanding that his courage against Goliath was not a sudden outburst, but the result of a lifetime of communion with and dependence on God. David's art was inseparable from his faith, and his poetry elevated the experience of trial to the status of a spiritual epic. The tragedy of the antagonists, Goliath and Saul, is presented as the inevitable consequence of pride and disobedience. Goliath, trusting only in metal and flesh, met his end by the stone of simplicity. Saul, trusting in his own judgment and ignoring the prophet's voice, lost his kingdom and his life. The contrast is the story's strongest moral lesson. Malice destroys itself, while faith, even in apparent weakness, triumphs. David's triumph is the restoration of divine order, justice manifested to correct human injustice. The conclusion of this epic saga is not merely about the end of a reign, but about the enduring legacy. David established a model of faithfulness that became the moral compass of Israel. The story of the little shepherd who defeated the giant with a sling is told and retold, not as a myth, but as a historical fact that proves the power of the covenant. The narrative fulfills its mission of elevating the drama, focusing on spiritual transformation and the feeling that David's victory was an inevitable fulfillment of divine purpose, a testament to all generations that faith is the true weapon. The grandeur of the ending lies in the enduring contrast. David, who was once viewed with disdain by his brothers and the king himself, was now seated on the throne, and his descendants would become the lineage of messianic hope. The narrator reiterates that the humiliation of the beginning was the fertile ground for the final glory. He who had been the most unlikely of heroes became the most celebrated of kings, proving that divine election is not based on human criteria of strength and stature, but on the purity of heart and the integrity of faith. David's life is a chronicle of how the Eternal chooses the weak to confound the strong and the simple to shame the wise of the world. The reader's satisfaction is fully achieved by contemplating the entirety of David's journey, from the fear and indignation in the valley of Elah to the peace and justice of his reign in Jerusalem. The narrative is a complete arc of redemption. The final detail of Goliath's sword, which David kept as a symbolic trophy, was not merely an object of war, but a physical reminder that the enemy's power can be reversed and used against him through the intervention of the God of Israel. David's triumph is the triumph of faithfulness. He did not seek revenge against Saul, but obedience and justice, and that is why the Eternal honored him. Saul's malice crumbled in his own loneliness and despair, while David's patience was rewarded with the crown. The account is an epic tale that emphasizes that the path to exaltation invariably passes through the valley of trial, and that unwavering faith is the only passport to the fulfillment of the higher purpose. David's epic concludes with the certainty that the promise was gloriously and completely fulfilled. The young man who refused to fight in the armor of men ruled with the armor of faith, and his legacy is living proof that any giant can be defeated when the heart is in the right place, aligned with the will of the Eternal. The story becomes an eternal landmark that true courage resides in conviction, and that triumph is the inevitable fulfillment of the covenant. The contrast between the shepherd and the king becomes the prophetic legacy of the story. David, the unlikely hero, proved that spiritual strength surpasses any earthly power. He not only defeated a giant, but inaugurated an era of faith and unity for Israel, cementing the concept that the nation was governed by the Eternal, and its king was merely his representative. The account of his reign is the culmination of a transformative journey, where suffering and humiliation were converted into wisdom and majesty, and the final triumph echoed the faithfulness demonstrated in the darkest moments of trial. The chronicle of David and Goliath is therefore more than a battle. It is an ancient tale of redemption, where divine justice is the driving force of the narrative and faith is the key to victory. The emotion of the account lies in the reverence for the intervention of the Eternal and the profound satisfaction of seeing humility exalted and arrogance brought down. The before and after of the Valley of Elah resonates through the centuries, ensuring that the legacy of the anointed shepherd is an eternal beacon that the impossible bows before unwavering conviction and the superior covenant. Do you want more Bible stories filled with faith, teachings, and heartwarming moments? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow us with each new story.